Many of you this week have learned some sources related to the tragic situation of agunot, of women who are chained in marriages that unfortunately have dissipated and are no longer viable. In the time of the Gemara, the classical aguna was usually a situation in which the husband was lost at sea, on a business trip, or God forbid captured and was not able to give the get, to give a religious divorce, and the woman was in a situation of a kind of limbo, not being able to live and get remarried and continue with her life. Today, we confront a different situation, unfortunately, of people who use the halakhic system in a really terrible, horrible way to hurt other people. And this is one of the challenges that today, within the Orthodox community, that we have to face. I'd like to ask Mishlaf to introduce us. I'm sorry? Okay. So this morning, the last number of years, we've been very privileged to host a panel discussing some of the approaches to dealing with the modern aguna crisis with some of the leading spokesmen and people who I really see for all of us as role models in the community. And if any of you grow up to follow in the footsteps of the wonderful speakers we have today, it will be a great success for all of us, for SAR and for the Jewish community. This morning we have three speakers. Dean Michelle Greenberg-Kobrin, who's the Dean of Students at Columbia Law School and as well as very involved in working to alleviate the situation of agunot in the community. We also have Rabbi Simcha Krauss, who is a longtime communal rabbi, Rabbi, teacher, as well as today the Dayan, the head Dayan, the Av Beit Din of the International Beit Din for which handles many, many serious issues, serious cases related to agunot and is trying to solve some of the most difficult situations, as well as Mrs. Blue Greenberg, Ms. Blue Greenberg, who is one of the pioneers in helping advocate for agunot. She was one of the founders of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, and has really been a prolific writer and a leader in our modern Orthodox community, as well as someone whose kids and grandkids went to SAR and was very instrumental in the success of SAR Academy and SAR High School. And of course, our school is named after JJ, Zichron Livracha. So it's really a pleasure. We're going to start with Dean Kobrin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm mostly here as Na'ama's mom. So, right? Okay. Before I start, I want to just say a couple of words just to situate this work. So first, you should know that any work that's been done in the last number of years on behalf of agunot is really all standing on the shoulders of the work of Blue Greenberg. So you really need to acknowledge this. I think just take a moment. Blue, as she is affectionately known, because no title would encompass all that she is to our community, was really the person who, with an enormous amount of heart and warmth and courage and conviction and persuasion. I teach negotiation and conflict resolution, but it's really all, she is the most remarkable person in this area, really galvanized the community to think hard about this. So that's one piece. So Rabbi Krauss was like the premier rabbi in Queens when I was growing up in Kew Garden Hills, and was so well respected for being not only an amazing shul rabbi, but for being someone who was just at the highest level of learnings and incredibly modest about all of this. Rabbi Krauss did not have to come out of his well-deserved retirement in order to try and help agunot, but really I think seeing a situation and seeing in transience very much is a hero in trying to help this. So you're very lucky to hear from the two of them today. I'll also acknowledge Rabbi Helfgott, who was my teacher way back when, and Mishlaf, who was my chavrusa, my own teacher. And it's really a privilege to just be here. And Amalek, who's my own teacher as well, in her own way. Okay, so with that, in 2004, the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown mounted an exhibit that they called Yahrzeit. And at that exhibit, they had it was an exhibit that was mounted on the third Yahrzeit of the events of September 11th, 2001, and was really meant to commemorate the terrible events that happened at 9/11, because the Museum of Jewish Heritage is situated right downtown, right where the towers fell. And as part of that exhibit, they had a series of forms that were issued by the Beit Din of America in the period following September 11th. So there were a number of women who lost their husbands that day, right? Their husbands got up and went to work and worked either in the towers or very close to the towers and were never heard from again. And the Beit Din of America, working quite diligently over a period of about a year and a half, was able to resolve those cases of real agunot, right? Women whose husbands got up, left, and then disappeared, and we didn't know what had happened to them. So they used the evidence they could collect, whether that was electronic recording of a card swipe into the World Trade Towers and the morning at the time before the planes hit the towers, whether it was a phone call from a certain floor of the towers that was above where the plane hit after the plane hits. They worked hard to collect evidence. There was really no DNA evidence in these particular cases in order to resolve the plight of 8 women who were declared agunot. The curator remarked that those set of forms that the Beit Din of America had issued formed a very sad set of bookends with another set of forms that the museum had just acquired at auction. And that set of forms was a set of forms in Hungarian and Yiddish that were issued in Hungary in 1945 by a Hungarian rabbi to women whose husbands had been sent to Auschwitz. Right? So again, they didn't know what had happened to their husbands, and they worked painstakingly to free those women from the status of aguna. So as Rabbi Helfgott said, these two examples are the examples of sort of the very classical aguna, right? The one that you spend more time reading about in the sources. A woman whose husband has disappeared, gone on a long journey, some maybe can no longer be found, and without knowing if he's just dead or alive, you have no way of knowing if she's a widow and free to remarry, or if in fact she's someone who's still married to a living person. But what we talk about most of the time when we talk about the case of agunot is not that situation, right? The case of agunot that we're talking about today, the modern case of the aguna, is a guy who, like, we know very well where he is. He's making noise, he's on Twitter, he's on Facebook, we know where he is, he's sort of yelling at us, we can find him. He's simply refusing to participate in the get process, right? So I know you guys studied some sources and you spent your year learning this in Gemara, but, right, so marriage and divorce, right, in the secular world, right, in America, so marriage and divorce is a status that's imposed on the two people, on the parties, by a third party, right? So when someone says, I now declare you husband and wife, that means that's in their power to make the two of you married, right? So either the court gets to do that when you fill out a marriage license, or a minister gets to do that, or that's, right? So there's a third party who decides you're married. Because a third party, let's say that's the state, right? Let's say New York State, for example, decides you're married, the third party can decide that you're unmarried. Right? They made you married, so they can make you unmarried. So that's how marriage as you see it works on TV, okay? And in the real world for most people. The way that marriage and divorce works in the Jewish tradition, as you know, is that it is a contract between the two parties, right? So there's a rabbi at weddings, but they're really there just to make sure things go right. They don't decide that you're married, right? The ketubah is the formal evidence of an agreement where the husband says he's going to have certain obligations towards the wife. He's going to feed her, he's going to clothe her, he's going to sexually provide for her. And the wife agrees to be bound by those obligations, and the ketubah evidence is that. So that's a contract between those two parties. Okay, so contracts, and this, some number of you will go to law school, and when you go to law school, you will learn that contracts require meetings of the minds. That means that both people have to agree, right? So you need contracts, you both need to agree to this contract. A get is basically what we call a termination agreement, right? It's another contract, right? Because the two of you agree to be married, so it's another contract that says the two of you agree to be unmarried, right? So you both need to agree, and then you're both unmarried. Meeting of the minds, or agreement, is much easier to get at the beginning of marriage than it is at the end of marriage, right? Because at the beginning of marriage, people want that to happen. And at the end of marriage, most people are usually not happy that their marriages have come to an end, and there's some amount of tension and stress regardless of what happened. So a get is essentially a termination agreement, an agreement that the parties are no longer married. And the get, according to Jewish law, which actually pairs on to contract law in the United States, has to be freely given and freely received. That means the husband has to willingly give it, and the wife has to willingly accept it. Okay, so the aguna problem happens, or the so-called modern-day aguna, which we call a mesurevet get, someone who's either refused a get or a victim of get refusal, happens when either a party refuses to freely give the get, right? The husband refuses to freely give the get, or the wife refuses to freely accept the get. Okay, so both parties, both the man and the woman, can refuse to participate. The way these statistics fall out, because you always hear about the guy, right? It's always the guy who's the bad guy. The reason that is because get refusal is a form of abuse that is often not the first, but often the last in a long line of abuse that brought a marriage to an end, whether that's emotional or verbal or physical abuse. The refusal to participate in the get process is really one more form of abuse. And abuse statistics, anywhere you track domestic abuse statistics in the entire world, 95+% of the abusers are male, and 95, the equivalent, right, +% of the victims are women. So although get refusal can happen on both sides, and I have dealt with some cases where it's the woman who's refused to participate, the vast majority of these cases, it's the guy who's refusing to participate, and that is because get refusal is a form of domestic abuse. So I'm going to refer to the get refuser from now on as the guy. Okay, so so that's how marriage and divorce happens. Why do people refuse to participate in the get process? Who knows? Why might people refuse to participate in that? Yeah? Tell me your names, everyone. When Serena. Serena and I recently met in her living room talking about just this topic.
So either one, they want to stay married, or maybe they're looking for, they want more money in the agreement.
Okay, so Serena gave us two reasons. One, that guy wants to stay married to this woman, right? Number two, they want more money than they might otherwise get through the rest of the process. Okay, so they want to get more or different things. Any other ideas? Yeah. Thank you, Miriam. Okay, so a couple things. They might just be really angry, like spiteful, so they're just going to be, a big bully because they're really angry. Or they don't want the woman to be able to get remarried, right? So that might be jealousy or possessiveness or something like that. Okay, any other ideas? Yeah, Zevi? They might enjoy really very much the feeling of control, right? They might really like the feeling of control. Any other ideas? I saw one more hand back there. Tell me your name. Joey? Okay, this feeling of power. So that's right, and power, control, right, anger, the keeping someone in a position, right, in a subservient position, those all relate to this question of abuse. Also, in America, people go through two parallel systems at the same time. They're going through the Jewish divorce process, which they're doing in a Beit Din, and they're going through a secular divorce process. And I'm happy to talk in the question and answers about what the secular divorce process looks like, but they might want concessions on property, right? The stuff that they get at the end of the marriage, custody, who gets to watch the kids, visitation, right, who gets to see the kids, and a whole series of other things that the court wouldn't give them. So they basically hold it as leverage. So I'll say, in many of the cases that I've dealt with, the women are in very terrible positions, right? So I told you that in many cases, get refusal is a form of abuse and not the first form of abuse. So women are sometimes in a position where they know they can have their freedom and be able to move on with their lives if they allow their ex to have custody or visitation rights to see their children they might not otherwise get, and the reason they're not going to get them is because they are abusive to the children, right? That's a really bad position to be in. Very often, husbands will refuse to pay child support. So for example, this yeshiva, we're lucky enough, SAR is the kind of place where if someone couldn't pay tuition, they could still go to school here. There are lots of schools, lots of Jewish schools, where if you're not paying tuition, they will throw you out, right? So if the dad refuses to pay tuition, then the wife doesn't have means. Kids end up on the street or suddenly in public school. Really very, very sad, and very difficult circumstances, forcing women to make very hard choices. I'll say another thing. The feeling of being not in control over your own life, of having no control over your own future, that feeling of powerlessness very often results in very severe emotional and psychological stress that often causes women who are going through this very terrible feeling to really begin to decompensate in lots of different ways. That's coupled with the fact that it's the very Jewish community and the very system of halakha that they rely on that is not offering them support. So that's really what the problem looks like. I'm going to switch now to talk a little bit about prenuptial agreements, and then you'll hear from Rabbi Krauss and from Blue about some other ways that people have worked to resolve this. So let me say first a word about contracts in Jewish in halakha, right? So you are all soon going to be able to leave some amount of chametz in your house, right? And then after Pesach, you're going to be able to eat that chametz, right? Alicia's going to be able to leave some chametz in his store, and after Pesach, we are all going to be able to buy that same chametz. Why? Because you're not allowed to have chametz on Pesach, right? So why can we do that? What's going to happen? Yeah, tell me your name. Mm-hmm. Right, so he's going to sell it to someone. What kind of person? A non-Jewish person, and then he's going to buy it back. When does he have to make that contract? Before Pesach. What happens if Alicia forgot, and it's the third day of Pesach, it's Chol HaMoed? Can he enter into the contract then? No, okay, so the answer is no. You have to do it before Pesach. Okay, Jews are allowed to lend to other Jews with interest, yes or no? No, okay, but they do. Why do they do that? Because they're greedy. That's one option. Okay, let's come with another one. Right, there's contract, right? There's a prosbul, right, where Jews execute a contract before they enter into the agreement, and that allows Jews to lend to other Jews and essentially charge interest in another way, right? Halacha has looked at complicated problems and come up with a series of contracts, all of which have to be executed means signed, sorry guys, all of which has to be signed before the thing happens to avoid the problem at the end. So there are the prenuptial agreement helps nobody who is already an aguna, okay? If you haven't entered into the prenuptial agreement, right, pre means before, right? So you're all going to take your SATs and your ACTs. If you haven't entered into this agreement before you get married, before you come to the end of your marriage, basically, then it won't help you, okay? It's a little bit like a shot. You have to take the vaccination to avoid the problem. So there are lots of different examples of prenuptial agreements that are out there. I'm happy to talk more about the other ones if you care, but I'm going to focus on the one that's most widely used in our modern Orthodox community. That's the one that was drafted by Rabbi Willig at the behest of the now defunct Orthodox Caucus in conjunction with the RCA. And that's the one that's been refined over a period of time. The last time it was refined, there was a committee, I think it was on a committee a couple years ago that refined it the last time. Okay, so that agreement says a couple of things. First of all, it says when the agreement kicks in. So it kicks in when you are no longer living together as husband and wife, okay? That doesn't mean that you necessarily have a civil divorce. That just means that the marriage looks functionally over. And when the marriage is functionally over, it says that the two people agree to go to Beit Din, and then they agree to do what Beit Din tells them to do about the end of marriage, okay? It also says if one of them doesn't do what the Beit Din tells them to do, so let's say the husband doesn't give the wife a get, then the husband is obligated to pay the wife a certain amount of money every day. In the agreement, it says $150 a day. He's obligated to pay her a certain amount of money a day until he does that thing, okay? So that's what the agreement says. Okay, did you learn the Rambam on kofinoto, right? Okay, so why can't we can't force someone to enter into the get process, I told you, right? Because it has to be freely given, right? And freely received, right? So we can't force someone, but the Rambam says that actually we can kind of force someone, right? When can we force someone? Okay. Zevi told me you learned it beforehand. Maybe someone else learned it. Okay, go ahead, Zev. Okay, so very good. It's a legal basis. It's a legal idea of consent. Kofinoto, you force him until he says, I want to. Acho marotzani, until he says, I want to. It's like this, it's called the doctrine of constructive consent. You force someone until they say, I want to. The idea is the true will of every Jew is to do what's right. Like, think about this in a high school setting. The true will of every Jew is to do what's right, so you beat them until you uncover their true will. You can only use that in a very small amount of cases where there's a kofin order. We're not going to get into those. So that doesn't work. And you can force him with fines or with money, right, with monetary penalties, and with physical beatings and with jail, okay? So in Israel, they do some of this, and we can talk about that. But that doesn't work for the prenup. You can't force someone with money in that way because that would result, unless it's a kofin case, which most of them aren't. So the way the money is structured in the prenuptial agreement is it's structured as a support obligation. The Gemara tells us that you can accept upon yourself the ability, you're obligated to support your wife after you get married. You can accept upon yourself an additional support obligation to give her more money, and it is structured in that way. Okay, here's how it practically works. The way it practically works is you go to Beit Din, or the guy is called to Beit Din. He comes or he refuses to come. If he refuses to come, the Beit Din keeps asking him to come. After the third time he doesn't come, they will kick in this monetary piece, and then the clock will start ticking, and eventually he will either have to pay the money or give her the get. Usually he gives her the get in exchange for paying her this type of money. The pieces that have played, the prenuptial agreement, it seems, anecdotally, has worked in every case that it's been tested. So what that means is that every couple that has had a prenup has eventually gotten a get, so far that we know of. Sometimes it takes a little longer, but it seems to take typically shorter than other terrible aguna cases. So that's really an important thing to know. What we do see happen is that not everyone signs a prenup before they get married. So I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is, I think when people hear about prenups, they think of like Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, right? Like those are the people who get prenuptial agreements. And I think people don't feel that they should do that. I think lots of people, when they get married and are young, are very much focused on the romance and the beauty and don't think bad things will happen at the end of marriage. And I think people find it uncomfortable to talk about very difficult things, like what might happen if your marriage doesn't go well at the time that you're getting married. However, just like with selling your chametz before Pesach, and just like with prosbol, it turns out that our community has created this document that really does have the best possible success of preventing the kind of cases you're going to hear about from Rabbi Krauss and from Blue. So where you're situated is you're sophomores and you're not thinking about this yet. But before you know it, you will soon be old enough to be bridesmaids and to show up at weddings and to remember to ask your friends if they did think about entering into a prenup and thought about how they could do this just like a vaccine, not so that they might get that's not because they might get sick, but because if everyone does it, everyone does it. One last point. This is why you should care about this, because how many of you know someone who is an aguna? Raise your hands. Okay, so some number of you, but a small percentage. So the reason you should care about the issue of igun is this. Okay, so when the Navi is talking, when the Navi Achronim are talking about our society, right, they constantly ask us to remember the Yatom and the Almanah, right, to remember the widows and the orphan. And they tell us that that is the way our communities are judged, right? The Navi says, Lama li rov zivchechem, like, I don't need your ritual, I don't need your korbanot. I want to know how you are taking care of the widow and the orphan. The widow and the orphan are the archetype of the people in our community who are most without protection. And in today's community, agunot are those who are left most without protection. That's why Blue's remarkable work in really pointing the community's attention to a small number of people, but a number of people who were left really all alone was so very critical. As a community, we are judged on how we think about those among us who are most vulnerable. And thinking about those actions in whether we remember them, in whether we say tefillot for them, in whether we go to rallies, and in whether we ourselves remember to ask our older brothers, sisters, and then eventually ourselves sign a prenuptial agreement is a very critical piece in taking a stand for being the kind of moral community you want to be. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to ask a good question if you didn't hear it. If he's not coming to the Beit Din anyway, how do they force him to give money? So the answer is, and this only happened once that I know about, is the prenuptial agreement is actually a contract that's enforceable in secular court. So you take the contract and you go to secular court where they're anyway arguing about all the various things related to divorce, and you enforce that as additional money that the ex-husband owes the wife. And that sum of money is added on to the total. Usually what happens then is the guy eventually agrees to give the get in exchange for that amount of money being wiped away, like in exchange for the wife forgiving that amount of money. Oh, okay, so this is, I'm curious what Rabbi Krauss and Blue will say about numbers, because this is really interesting. I would say okay, lots of times when people have already filled that out and already said that they're going to go in particular to one of two or three established, but there are lots of Beit Din. Most of them are corrupt and inept. As one person said to me who's at a good Beit Din, our luck is we've always only been inept and never been corrupt, right? So a lot of the Beit Din are not great, but most of the agreements have the name of a Beit Din that is a reputable Beit Din, and lots of where the fighting happens is even before they get to Beit Din, it's fighting over which Beit Din they'll go to. Since that's eliminated, and the Beit Din makes it clear what they expect will happen, often the get is given before this whole thing cycles up. So it's hard for me to get a sense of those numbers. Where they have cycled up, okay, so here is the case. There was a very bad guy who they had gotten married. A couple had gotten married very young. I knew them from camp, actually. They had gotten married very young. They were together about 12 years. He was accused of a crime that involved children in his community. Okay? She did not know anything about it, had children herself, stuck by him until the point at which he pled guilty, and then really wanted her dead. And he really didn't want to divorce her. He was thought this would help his case if he was still married. So he refused. She didn't have a copy of her prenup. The rabbi who had executed it at first couldn't find it. A bunch of people dug through, a rabbi who'd been a rabbi for 50 years, dug through his files. It took a couple of days. They eventually found the prenup, and as soon as he was presented with it, he sort of just gave in and gave her the get right there. So that's an example of how I've seen it work.
Okay. We'll ask Rabbi Krauss to speak for a few minutes. Again, we'll get some, if we still have time at the end, we'll get some more questions. The Chavod Kvodator.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Helfgott. Before, again, I will copy Dean Kobrin. Before I speak, I want to say something. I want to join Rabbi Helfgott and Dean Kobrin in saying something about the Beis Din that I have. Although whether you call us successful or not, you'll see later, but whatever we do and whatever we do good is in the language of the Rishonim. We are dwarfs on the back of a giant, and that giant is Blue Greenberg, who, without her seeing further than all of us, even though we are on her back, has really done everything, and therefore the International Beis Din was established. We're on her back, and we owe her, the Jewish community owes her a great yashikayach, and that's simply a word. It owes her much more than that. As a matter of fact, with me personally, the fact is that when I came to Israel, I made Aliyah. We made Aliyah, Esther and I, 10 years ago. And when I came there, I was invited by somebody to head his Beit Din for agunot. And I said no. And they pressured me, and I said no. It was about 7 years later, then when Blue Greenberg came and asked me to head this Beis Din, that I really didn't want to leave the retirement, but Blue Greenberg did what Dean Kobrin spoke about, Kofi no Sachi Yoma Rotzeani, and you couldn't say no to Blue, and that's the real truth, and that's what I'm doing here, heading this Beis Din. Since I have a few minutes, I want to discuss what we do. You heard Dean Kobrin speak about many ways of the aguna issue. Let me just go into a particular frame of reference. If you're a rabbi, we're studying in the rabbinate, getting smicha, and I hope that many of you would go either to yeshiva or marat school to learn smicha. Smicha doesn't belong only to one gender. I hope you all go. If you'd learn smicha and you'd learn for yadin, you would find that the part of the Gemara that deals with agunot, Mesechet Yevamot, for example, the last two prakim deal with Yevamot, but they deal with essentially what Dean Kobrin spoke about. The husband was lost in the sea, and so on and so forth. The kind of aguna that really was solved, or the Shulchan Aruch Even Hezer Siman Yud Zayin. It deals with the aguna that generally was solved. You know, if I would speak about a time reference, agunot till the beginning of the Shoah, essentially those problems are mostly solved. And you have many Sfarim and books, etc., etc. The problem that we confront now in the United States and in Israel, where most Jews live, the problem that we confront is that the husband is right here and says, I don't want to give you a get unless. For example, in our Beit Din, we have a woman who came to us, yeah, my husband wants to give me a get if I'll pay him $500,000. No, and he wouldn't take a penny less. What do you do then? Why does the problem exist? So, Kobrin spoke to you about it, about the contract and so on and so forth. Let's put it in different words. Who makes you're learning Kiddushin now. Who essentially makes the wedding? Who essentially is the actor in a Chatuna? Who makes the Kiddushin act? Who? I will not ask my grandchildren if they don't volunteer. Anyone else? Who makes the wedding? Who has the power of doing the Kiddushin? How does the marriage take place? Huh? The man and the wife. But who makes the Kiddushin actually? By the man. What if the woman would say, Hare at mekudesh? Hare ani mekudeshet lach. Or Hare at what? How do you know? Huh? Where's the Gemara? Where's the Gemara? You learned, no? But not Tanhu v'nas Amrahi, not Nahiv Amrahu. He makes the, yes? Okay, yikach ish isha, perfect. In other words, the male. So therefore, he has to break the kiddushin. How do we know that the male breaks the kiddushin? Yeah, somebody who didn't, I want everyone to speak. Also, I will follow, I also want to know your name, but Serena Kaufman, I know, but you, I don't know. Okay? No, he says, how do we know, however, that he, that the, okay, but that, okay, fine. And if he doesn't want to give a divorce, she can get divorced. And that's the problem of our aguna. He must give the, she can't divorce herself alone, so to say. She can't go away. The real truth is, you check the Rambam. The Rambam says by Bnei Noach, by non-Jews, just a gerushin is affected by the woman simply leaving the husband. If that would be our case, we would have no problem, but we don't have that. The man has to give the get. Okay. So let's see how is a marriage terminated? How is a marriage terminated? Are there ways of terminating a marriage? You learned the first mission in Kedushin, no? What is it? A get. Okay. What's the Lashon HaGemara there? What's the Lashon? Ha'isha niknis. And then what does it mean? V'kone et atzma. What does it mean, v'kone et atzma? She buys herself back. How does she buy herself back? What, through a get, or only a get? Anything else? Does something else help? Besides the husband dying, when he's alive. Anything else? Cannot something else undo the Kiddushin? Can anything, yes? What? Speak louder, I don't. If he's alive, yeah, how else does a marriage can break up? If he's missing, let's assume he's missing, that's also a tragedy. But that we can take care of, yes? Anyone else? Rashi says, there's a entrance to Rashi, since you're learning Kedushin. Rashi says there what, V'kones atzma? What is V'kones atzma? What does Rashi say there? I just want you to know. Yes? If you don't know, then you don't know. Forget. Rashi says, V'kones atzma mibala, from her husband. Tell me, you would learn otherwise. Who else? Who else is she kones atzma from? Apparently, what's Rashi trying to say? Apparently, Rashi is trying to say that, yes, the only way is a get. Indeed, there are two ways. One way of a marriage being terminated is by a get. Misa Zabal is something else. Misa Zabal is a heter. It's not the Kenyan. But termination of a marriage is only by a get. Indeed, there's a school of thought that says so. That says that you can only terminate a marriage by a get. If that's correct, then we would have no way of solving our problem except by either money, paying the money, or what Greenberg-Kobrin mentioned, except that in America, the rabbinate has no power to be kofeoto. Why not? What's political science say? Why can't I, Simcha Krauss, be kofe Ruvain to give a get? Why can't I? I'm in America, why not? Yes? Because in America there is what? Separation of church and state. So there is no way of being kofe somebody. In Israel, since the Medina, Baruch Hashem, there is a Medina, the rabbinate has the right to be kofe somebody, and if a Beit Din is kofe somebody to give the get is valid because, as the Kobrin quoted the Rambam, when you say Rosianya, you really want it, etc., etc. But in the Golan, there is no way. Nevertheless, there is another way. There is a way of what we would call voiding a marriage. And that is a position that has been held by Achronim and great Rabbonim, including Moshe Feinstein, I'm only mentioning the name that you know, for hundreds of years. How do you avoid a marriage? All of a sudden you find out that the marriage that took place 20 years ago, the witnesses were relatives. So Mamela, the marriage is not valid, and that's what. That's a relatively easy way. When I say easy way, it's objective and so on and so forth. Then, however, there's another case of two shita. And this is the big problem these days. I'll tell you the Gemara's Lashon, and then I'll tell you the matter. If we find, the Chotan and the Kala find that there was a mum there was a certain problem. In other words, the Gemara speaks about physical defects in a man or a woman. You know, these days, you can't think of that because you know you go out and you know your boyfriend a long time or girlfriend. But in those days, it happened to be that a person was mekadesh through a shliach, no? Your father knew, you imagine you're a girl and your father knew that there's a wonderful boy in Texas. So he sent the shliach and she was the mekadesh al yid shliach and you were married. And all of a sudden you come home and you find that the boy is a defective guy. So what do you do then? That's a problem. But it's not a problem. Why? Because that's also taught. If you didn't know about it before the marriage, and you went into the marriage and you cheated, for example, let me give you an example. A person is mentally problematic, okay? A boy and girl going out. They go out for a while. And the boy hid from the girl that he is a certain real schizophrenic. And she didn't notice it. So then the halacha is that the girl could come and say, I only found out now. And if you can find out, that's a way, that's called voiding a marriage by ta'ut. Any questions? Feel free to ask me questions. No questions? Yeah. Okay, because the Gemara says that in case where she was not meta'em, where she did not actually deceive him, shelo hita'ato. Okay, well, what if that's exactly the point. If they spoke about it, then, well, the Gemara doesn't say the scenario. You go out for 6 months, and you don't tell the person you go out with that you have this problem. Then conceivably, if we find that, we can void the marriage. Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Why doesn't it matter? Who told you it doesn't matter? Okay. All right. Okay. What does Tavl Meitav mean? So what does that mean? Okay. A woman would like to marry any kind of person. As long as she's married, she's happy. That is correct. There's a chazaka like this. No. Okay, there's a case like that. So I'll tell you honestly, that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons that certain Batei Din will not agree to void a marriage by ta'ut, when the ta'ut is that, because of the concept of tavla meitav tandu. So I want to tell you something. If I will be invited by Rabbi Helfgad again, or by a faculty member to discuss this issue, I will be glad to discuss it with you, and I will be glad to discuss it tell you why our Bezdin does not go by that. Because it seems from the Gemara that while indeed there is such a chazakah, basically there is a presumption that the woman would like to be married, there are plenty of exceptions. For example, when the Gemara discusses mum, a regular, quote, a regular mum, a regular defect, then indeed the Gemara invokes tav lamet tav tandu. But there's a concept in something is called the mum gadol, a terribly big mum. That we don't say tav lamet tav tandu. That happened. This discussion was in the Rishon. There's a sefer called Or Zorah, a Rishon of the Marach Zorah, where the father was mekadesh his daughter to a blind person, totally blind. In those days, there were no schools to learn blind. If you were blind, you were totally out of it. She didn't like it. She revolted, and she came to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, other rabbi said, yes, tav lamet tav tandu. And the other rabbi says, what are you talking about? This is the totally mum gadol. This is the mum gadol. And then you don't say tav lamet tav tandu, because it's better if she is alone and she can live a productive life than just working for him, etc. I remember we speaking about the year 1000 where there was no such thing as guiding dogs, etc., etc., etc. You understand? So yes, there are exceptions to that. And that's why some Bate Din ad hayom hazeh will not take it if a woman argues defect and they make themselves as if they don't know the tshuva that I mentioned. They do know it, but for some reason they don't. Because for some reason they decide to. I'll give you a horrific story that I had. I don't know if my time is over, tell me. Do I have 1 minute? Okay, I have 1 minute. A woman came to us from Canada, the international business. And she started the story telling me this, that, and the other. And Ben Hadvarim, she tells me, we had a civil marriage. We didn't have a religious marriage. And I'm 17 years in Agunah, and the husband doesn't want to give me a get. And I had a civil marriage. Why did you have a civil marriage? Because my husband is an atheist, he doesn't believe in this nonsense. So I pinched myself first, whether I hear the right thing. And then she said, can you tell me the story again? She said, yes, I had a civil marriage. Why do you have a civil marriage? Because the husband is an atheist. So immediately, what's the halacha now? If it was a civil marriage, you think they were edim at a civil marriage? You would think they were edim ksherim, that the justice of the peace looked for edim ksherim? So obviously I told her immediately, the Bezdin told her immediately and gave her a note that she's free to marry. A civil marriage is a non-Jewish marriage. A non-Jewish marriage is not recognized by halacha, so you were not married. But I couldn't believe it, so I called a particular rabbi. I say, why did you do that? He says, because isn't it a civil marriage? So he told me, well, because I feel that I have to be machmir like Rabbi Henkin, who holds that the only way of doing it is the get. So I asked, that's very nice, you machmir like Rabbi Henkin, but what do you do with on the back of an aguna, who is an aguna 17 years, on her back, you machmir like Rabbi Henkin? You have to have brains to know that a civil marriage, a civil marriage is nothing. And he knew it. But some people are afraid, and that's part of the problem in the Jewish world, but I have no more time, I'm sorry.
We're now going to hear for a few minutes from Ms. Blue Greenberg, who's going to conclude the program for us.
After all the things that were said about me, I can only go downhill by opening my mouth. But I want to say, firstly, thank you very much. And I want to say, I'll be just very brief in my comments of praise for my colleagues. And Michelle is so modest. She, aside from being one of the extraordinary young Jewish leaders of our generation, she had a great deal to do with the Beit Din of America revisions and the creation of the prenuptial agreement and the revisions, and probably no other woman in our time has had as much influence on the Beit Din of America as has had Michelle. And Rabbi Krauss, it goes without saying, he's a gadol hador. He's unflinchingly courageous. He's one of the few in this generation and probably in the last century to combine tremendous lumdus with backbone and courage. And I could tell you for days how he deals with the fierce opposition to his work and stands tall and strong in his halakhic convictions. I want to leave the time for the questions to the all of panelists. So I am going to summarize. I'm actually going to select from a talk that was too long. I didn't stick to my time limit in preparing my talk, so I'm doubly going to be concise here. And I think the only thing that I can really do is to, and I don't think well on my feet in terms of summary, but I'm going to tell you give you an anecdote which I think puts the thing into perspective for me, because what we are talking about are solutions to, and this is, I swallow hard when I say this, is to a very problematic law. The Jewish laws of divorce are highly problematic. It took me many years to be able to say that as a Jew who loves halakha and wants her entire life to be guided by halakha, to say that a halakha is problematic, as I say, is difficult. It took me many years. And what the solutions that you've heard is to try to circumvent the problem of halakha of this particular law, which gives the absolute right, and it is known in the literature, gives absolute right to the husband to control the giving of the get. And although for many years that was, in the societies in which Jews lived, that was standard procedure. It was the way all societies function, where men had control over marriage and divorce. In our times, we understand it's not an adequate response to a divorce situation in which a woman's dignity has to be respected. And I also want to say that even as I critique the understanding of the law, the development of the law for centuries in protecting the absolute right of the husband, I want to say that the rabbis indeed went further in protecting the rights of the women than any of the parallel societies in which women were bought and sold as chattel. So I just want to tell you an anecdote, a personal anecdote that puts this into perspective for me. Because by what right can we say this is a problematic law? We live by halakha. It guides our life in every respect. In 1985, I was in Nairobi for the celebration of the end of the decade of women. And I was with a group of 8 women. We were on an interreligious consultation, and every day some other women were brought to meet our little group. And one day, a woman, I guess probably in her mid-40s, came, very dignified, told her story, not crying, in a soft voice, but her story was that she came from an African village, and she was the mother of 8 children, many of them teenagers. And 5 years earlier, her husband called her to the door and held the door open and held his hand on the doorknob or handle. And he said to her, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you," and which was the formula, and at which point she had to walk out. In the intervening 5 years, she did not see her children. She was not permitted to come back to the home. She tried to enlist the help of people in the village, but no one would help her because that was the law. The law was the law. And I remember my response at the time was thinking with great pride, Judaism, we don't have that kind of a problem. We're so far progressive. And I thought about her for a long time and about her pain, but then I forgot about her. Then in the year 2008 or 9, I was involved in writing a chapter for a book on peacemaking, and I came to the assignment was given to me to write about human rights laws in the Torah, in biblical Judaism. A subject I had not worked on before intensively or directly, but something I came to with great zest, because the thing that is always so astounding to me and fills me with such tremendous pride every Shabbat reading the Parshiot is the human rights quotient of the Torah. it's really an unbelievable contribution to civilization at large. I would say that there's, sound chauvinistic, religiously so chauvinistic, but I don't think there's any other religion that has such an impact on world civilization in terms of the human rights of men and women and societies. And it starts with the principle that every person is created in the image of God, and then it goes into very specifics, such as don't make a worker sweat all night long that he's not going to get his pay. Pay him at evening time, or leave the gleanings in the field for the poor so that they can come anonymously and have food to eat, and so on and so on. But as I was writing this about human rights, I also had to put in where I thought the Torah fell short, and I put in the law of divorce. Is our session over? Okay. That, when the book was at the publishers, I realized. I knew I should have just opened this up to questions for everyone, so I have to just finish this comment, is that what the Torah was about, which I think the rabbis living in chauvinist societies for the generations, what the Torah was about in the law of divorce, in Devarim, and he shall write her a writ of divorce, was to protect the woman in cases of divorce, such as the Nairobi woman, such as the women all over the world today where there's oral divorce. It was to give her status. It was to give a responsibility to a husband that he couldn't kick his wife out the door without according her some sort of dignity and protection. The rabbis built in those protections. But the principle of a man's absolute right was also developed, unfortunately, and many husbands came to see the law as a husband's right rather than his responsibility. And what Dean Kobrin is doing in terms of the prenuptial agreement, and what Rabbi Krauss is doing, which is, I think, the first attempt in history to find a systemic solution, a transparent systemic solution of removing the absolute right of a husband, is what I think the Torah, what Hashem had in mind in terms of protecting the vulnerable, the meta-halakhic principle of justice, of righteousness, and protecting those who are at a disadvantage in our societies. Thank you.